This is the first part of a two-part series covering the lymphatic system. The first part will cover the basic functions of the system, as well as discussing the formation of lymph and pathways of lymphatic flow. The second webinar will cover lymphatic tissues and organs in more detail. Now, the lymphatic system has three major functions. One of the things to realize is that there's a close interrelationship between various body systems, including the lymphatic system's relationship with the immune system, cardiovascular system, and digestive systems. So one of its functions is body defense. So you think of immune system. The various tissues and organs that are part of the lymphatic system are rich in lymphocytes and supporting phagocytic cells, which help protect against infection. In addition, the lymphatic system is important in fluid balance, so it returns leaked fluid back to our circulation. In addition, specialized lymphatic capillaries called lacteals are involved in absorption of dietary fat. Now, the various components or structures that are part of the system include the fluid connective tissue, referred to as lymph, which is very similar to plasma, with the exception that it has slightly different protein concentrations. After meals, it can have very high fat content because of the function of those lacteals, and because of its role in the immune system, it can have, obviously, bacteria and viruses. Now, the lymph is carried along various lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels are going to carry that fluid back into the cardiovascular system. Now, besides the lymph nodes, there are other lymphatic tissues and organs that we'll discuss, such as the spleen and the thymus and tonsils, etc. Now, the lymphocytes and supporting phagocytic cells, such for example, macrophage, are also components of the system, and we'll talk about those in person. Now, we're going to start with the formation of lymph. Now, tissue fluid is blood plasma that has passed through the cardiovascular capillary walls into, you see here, these interstitial spaces. So it's coming out from blood capillaries, minus, obviously, very large plasma proteins and blood cells. Now, as fluid increases in the interstitium, that increasing pressure will force that tissue fluid into these lymphatic capillaries. Now, you'll notice there's a very, very close relationship between the lymphatic capillaries and the arteries and the veins. It's perfectly designed to be next to it to pick up that tissue fluid. Now, lymph is fluid that has entered a lymphatic capillary. So it's not lymph until it's entered that lymphatic capillary. Again, it's very similar to blood plasma without the large plasma proteins. Now, lymph formation, it's important that we have the lymphatics there because it prevents accumulation of excess tissue fluid, which can lead to edema. Now, the lymphatic pathways will begin at the level lymphatic pathways, I said, will begin at the level of lymphatic capillaries. Now, lymphatic capillaries are closed-end tubes. So you see it here, they're closed-end that extend into those interstitial spaces, and it's parallel to the blood capillaries, and they're composed above endothelium, just like we see in our blood vessels. Now, the endothelial cells will overlap, which actually act as one-way valves. So you see here, we have lymphatic valves, and lymphatic valves prevent lymph from flowing backwards. Now, the endothelial cells overlap like shingles on a roof, and each is fastened to a nearby anchoring filament. So the filaments are anchored out here in the connective tissue, which is very important during edema because it's actually going to help to prevent swelling. It pulls open these little openings here. You see these pores, and so more and more fluid would enter the lymphatic capillary, which would help prevent edema from forming. Now, lymphatic capillaries are found throughout our body, with exceptions of any avascular tissues, so tissues without a blood supply. We don't have them in the central nervous system. The central nervous system will have its own mechanism to prevent any type of edema from forming. It won't be found in the pulp of the spleen, and the spleen is a lymphatic organ, but you will not find the lymphatic capillaries there, and you also will not find it in bone marrow. Bone marrow is where we're going to be producing lymphocytes. Another thing to realize is lymphatic capillaries do include lacteals, which are capillaries that we find in the villi of the small intestine. They're involved in fat absorption. Now, lymphatic vessels are formed by merging of lymphatic capillaries. They, again, similar to veins, they have valves, which can prevent backflow of lymph. Now, lymphatic capillaries will come together to form what we refer to as afferent lymphatic vessels, which will lead to lymph nodes. Now, lymph nodes is where we're going to have a site where we're going to filter that lymph in case there's any bacteria or viruses present that will mount an immune response against it. Now, the lymph nodes are found throughout our body, and they occur pretty much in groups or change along pathways of large lymphatic vessels. Now, the largest are found in locations where peripheral lymphatics connect to the trunk. So areas like the axillary lymph nodes, the inguinal lymph nodes. Now, but you'll see some other locations where we have the lymph nodes. Having the lymph nodes in strategic locations will prevent any potential problems and allow us to detect and deal with any possible infection before they affect vital organs in the trunk. And the second webinar will talk about the structure of the lymphatic nodes, or lymph nodes, sorry. Now, the vessels that leave the lymph nodes are referred to as efferent lymphatic vessels. They will leave the lymph nodes and come together to form what are referred to as lymphatic trunks. So they'll come what we call lymphatic trunks. Now, lymphatic trunks are going to drain certain regions of the body. Now, the lymphatic trunks will then empty into two lymphatic ducts. One, the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. Now, this picture shows you the thoracic duct, which you see here. Here's the thoracic duct. I'll just draw a line right down here. Now, the base of that thoracic duct is referred to as the cisterna chyli. Now, it is formed from the merging of the right and left lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunk. So these are draining the lower parts of your body. Now, the thoracic duct will eventually empty the lymph into your left subclavian vein right here. The right lymphatic duct empties into the right subclavian vein. But what you'll see here is there's kind of a weird distribution of the collecting ducts. The right lymphatic duct only drains the right side of the head, the right arm, and the right side of the upper thorax, while the thoracic duct drains everything else. But collectively, the lymph is going to empty again from capillaries to the vessels, to the trunks, empty into our lymphatic ducts, then eventually empty into the right and left subclavian veins, returning that fluid back into our circulatory system. Now, the lymph is going to have a number of functions. So it's kind of going to repeat myself from what I said at the very beginning. One of the things that the lymph does is it's very important in fluid balance. So any leaked fluid from the blood capillaries is going to empty back into the lymphatic system, which will return that leaked fluid back into our circulatory system. We produce about 2 to 3 liters of lymph a day. Now, our blood volume is about 5 liters. So if we did not return that 2 to 3 liters, just think of what it's going to do to your blood volume and what it would do to your blood pressure. So it's very important that we return that leaked fluid back into the circulatory system. Another function, obviously, is body defense. The lymph takes a detour through those lymph nodes where it's cleansed of debris, and then it's examined by various cells of the immune system, including B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes and natural killer cells and macrophage. They're the Foreign materials such as bacteria and virus are usually going to be prevented from entering blood capillaries if the lymph node works effectively. So lots of times it prevents any potential infection early on. What we have a dilemma though is that because lymphatic vessels are so porous that bacteria and viruses can travel through them very easily, cancer cells can travel through them very easily. So if for some reason the lymph nodes don't fight off it effectively enough, we can have it being distributed through your body, and could be responsible for metastasis of, say, certain types of cancer. Now, another function of that lymph is the absorption of fat. So fat that's been digested is going to be absorbed in the villi of your small intestine, but it's going to be repackaged up as we'll refer to as chylomicrons, and then transported right here in these lacteals. And the lacteals will then empty into the lymphatic system. So we'll start with, they'll say the cisterna chyli, then it travels up the thoracic duct, eventually into the left subclavian vein. Now, we have an issue though with lymphatic flow, is that lymphatic flow is under low pressure. It doesn't have a heart as a pump, and it may not flow easily without the aid of some sort of external forces. Similar, and it's very similar to when we talked about venous return. So some of these things you see are very common to returning this fluid back into our circulatory system is very similar to what we talked about, how we get blood from veins back up to the heart. Is one of the things that we have is we have skeletal muscles. So skeletal muscles are, when they're contracting, they can act as kind of external compressors and help to, kind of similar to when we talked about venous return, like a milking action, help to get the lymph moving back to the left or right subclavian veins. And again, we also have those valves which help prevent any backflow. Breathing movements, respiratory movements also aid with lymph flow. So as a reminder, is when you inhale, blood goes back to the heart, similar with lymphatic flow. So inhalation or inspiration helps with moving lymph back up to the heart, or not back to the heart, but allow it to flow. In addition, larger lymphatic vessels do have smooth muscle, and smooth muscle does respond to, if you stretch it, it will contract. And so what happens if you have a large amount of lymph that's moving into this lymphatic vessel with smooth muscle, you stretch it. You stretch a smooth muscle, it will automatically contract. So that will help in continuing to move lymph along the lymphatic pathways. Now, a problem though that can occur is if you have a condition that interferes with lymphatic flow. It can cause that lymph to, or the tissue fluid to stay in the tissues and lead to swelling of tissues. And we're referred to as lymphedema. So lymphedema is any condition that interferes with the flow of lymph. It's not exactly the same as when we talk about edema. Here it's specifically caused by somehow interfering with the flow of lymph, and it can lead to swelling of the tissues. Now, on the left, what you'll see over here, these two pictures, these are pictures of people with lymphedema, and these were not being treated properly. Lymphedema can be congenital. Most often it's caused from damage to lymph nodes that can occur during surgery, often during cancer surgery. But if left untreated, it can be disfiguring and cause some other issues. So these two people weren't being properly treated. It's treatable, but it's not curable. And what you'll see is this accumulation of fluid in the tissues, and it can be very disfiguring. Over on the other part of the screen, this is an example of lymphatic filariasis. And here's filariasis, can't say it. It's also referred to often as elephantiasis, because the the limbs could start looking like we see with the elephant limbs, like their feet. It is a tropical infection in which patients can suffer from lymphedema. Now, the condition is caused by infection with parasites classified as nematodes, they're roundworms, and it's spread from person to person by mosquito. So if an infected person gets bit by a mosquito, the mosquito goes and bites another person, that's how it can be transmitted. The infection usually occurs in childhood, and it can remain hidden. But what it can do is it could lead to damage to the lymphatic system. The adult worms will lodge into lymphatic vessels and disrupt the normal function of the lymphatic system. And these worms can live in, on average, anywhere up to about 8 years, and during that time produce millions of larvae, immature larvae that circulate in the blood. Now, some of the treatments for edema, and it's going to be different from this one, so I don't have really time to talk about what they need to do with these people. But this is it's millions and millions and millions. I mean, hundreds of millions of people are affected by this in about 50-something countries in the world. We don't really see it in the United States, but it affects a lot of other countries. One of the treatments for lymphedema is compression, using compression. This is something you could see with people who have got varicose veins. They have problems with edema, and they use compression. And the compression helps to control swelling by providing a pressure that's needed to encourage flow into capillaries, like an external pressure. So you'll see some people will have them up for their arms, some people will have them for their legs. So that is one of the various treatments that they use for lymphedema. Now, this is the end of the first part of the webinar series for lymphatic system. The second one will cover the lymphatic tissues and lymphatic organs.